Why in the world would you want to marry an actor? They deceive people for a living. Science undermines the best parts of society. Art enhances the worst parts. The immigrant is dangerous because he introduces foreign ideas, values, and customs. The emigrant is dangerous because he sets up an example of abandoning the community. Socrates didn't write a book. Confucius, Jesus, Buddha, the great founders of the great intellectual traditions didn't write books. They cared about living the good life and didn't just write books about it. Science and philosophy are things good in themselves, just not in the hands of what Rousseau derogatorily calls the people. If you clicked on a 2-hour-long philosophy lecture by your own choice, I'm afraid Rousseau's got some bad news for you. The very intellectual pursuits that you delight in, philosophy, science, art, are the very things preventing you from a good life. That seems crazy, okay? How can science and art be bad things? And how can Rousseau, one of the greatest minds of the Enlightenment, attack Enlightenment while producing some of the most influential works of the Enlightenment? These are the questions we're going to answer in this lecture on the first discourse. This book is going to turn all your intuitions upside down, and with any luck, it will be your last. The Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, the first discourse, has a thesis that is as simple as it is shocking. I quote to you Rousseau. Our souls have become corrupted in proportion as our sciences and our arts have advanced. The first discourse is a philosophical attack on philosophy. It's a scientific refutation on science, and it's an artistic takedown of art. And it's precisely because how highly we value all three that we must engage with it. Rarely is there a culture like ours that so worships erudition, learning, curiosity with so little reservation. Far are we from the lesson from Oedipus that knowing more could be dangerous. Far are we from Constantinople destroying its printing press. And far are we from the Caliph Omar, who burned the Library of Alexandria. Rousseau's going to show that this anti-intellectual's attitude and actions are a lot wiser than you think. Because why, when science and technology are fulfilling all of its promises, alleviation from poverty, curing of disease, intelligent machines, are more and more people dissatisfied with modernity? Why, when the arts and culture has never been given more free rein, do we ourselves feel more constricted, lonely, and alienated? Why, in the midst of our luxury and our idleness, have we never felt more busy? Rousseau's answer is that the very arts and sciences that we mistook to be the culmination of our civilization is actually not only the cause of our current ills, but leading us to collapse. This is not some speculative prophecy, but Rousseau reminds us it's the shape of concrete history. Egypt once produced great kings and pharaohs. They became the birthplace of philosophy and arts in the West. And for 2,000 years, they've only known foreign rulers. Greece, were once peopled by heroes like Achilles and Theseus, vanquished Asia twice, once with Troy, another time Persia, early 5th century BC. Then the Athenian Golden Age happened. Sophocles, Plato, Aristotle, and by the 4th century, it fell to the Macedonian yoke. Rome began with a rustic republican virtue and became mortally corrupted by the very enlightened Greeks that they conquered, enslaved, and imported. I quote to you Rousseau. Ever since the learned have begun to appear among us, so Rome's own philosophers themselves said, good men have been in eclipse. Until then, the Romans had been content to practice virtue. All was lost when they began to study it. Everywhere Rousseau looks, he finds the same story. Enlightenment finds an ignorant but virtuous people. It gives them talents, but it takes away their virtue. And it leaves them conquered, corrupt, and ignorant once more. Enlightenment in the West begins in Egypt, it goes to Greece, then to Rome. Enlightenment abandons Europe, leaving it to the Dark Ages. It brews, it stews in Constantinople, and by the time of Rousseau, makes a return to Europe. This is the slithering path of enlightenment that has left destruction in its wake, and understanding its nature will be the goal of our lecture. Part 1, why Rousseau thinks that arts and sciences corrupt. Part 2, what Rousseau's solution is to this corruption. And Part 3, what does this mean for the technological societies of the 21st century? Let's begin with Part 1. The choice that Rousseau puts in front of us is the choice between ignorant virtue or enlightened vice. And there's no better example of this difference than between Sparta and Athens. The Athenians, for Rousseau, are slick-talking tricksters. The Spartans are the exact opposite. They're known for their terseness, but also their virtue. The Athenian education system is grounded on rhetoric. If you want to get elected in democracy, you've got to know how to flatter people. The Spartan education is the agoge. It rips young boys from the private family, subjects them to the harshest military training known to man, and cultivates a form of discipline, an iron will, and a willingness to sacrifice themselves for the state. The Athenians, they left us with beautiful art, architecture, philosophy, tragedies. What did the Spartans leave us with? Almost nothing, except for a few heroic models, exemplars of virtue like Leonidas to imitate. But when it comes to educating a citizenry, one heroic exemplar is worth more than all the ethics textbooks in the world combined. And as a result, despite Athens' drastic material advantages, Sparta ultimately triumphed in the Peloponnesian War. So why is there this tension between Athens and Sparta? Why do the arts and sciences corrupt? The answer is because artists and scientists, intellectuals, are people. And as people, they are both self-interested and prideful. So in this next section, we're going to do a first pass in exploring the relationship of self-interest, pride, and how it co-opts enlightenment for its own ends. The relationship between self-interest and enlightenment is quite easy to understand, even if it's a bit unintuitive. Now, we commonly think that following our animal sentiments, our feelings, our emotions, is what leads us to be immoral, to be selfish. And reason is what teaches us morality, makes us better. But Rousseau flips it on its head. Rousseau says, we naturally have a wellspring of pity and compassion for others. It might not be as strong as our self-interest, but it's actually reason that comes in and prevents us from helping. So when you go out there and you see, let's say, a homeless person on the street, what Rousseau thinks is going on internally is that you have a natural wellspring of pity, that you want to help the homeless person. But then reason comes in and says, he might be dangerous, or he deserves it, he should have worked harder himself. Or the utilitarian, if I go to the office 5 minutes sooner, I'm going to make $30 more and I'm going to help more beggars. For Rousseau, more often than not, the development of the intellect teaches us to better justify, defend, and advocate for our own self-interest and the interests of our faction. Whether it's politicians justifying atrocities, whether it's lawyers paid as hired guns, whether it's artists pandering to patrons. So that's self-interest, and that's quite easy to understand. What's a bit more subtle is the mechanisms of pride. Now, as a first pass, pride is the desire to be esteemed, the desire to be recognized as better than others. So unlike in self-interest, where you're trying to get a concrete good, money, food, sex, what pride wants is recognition. And as a result, a lot of prideful activities can come off as actually altruistic. When you post on social media in support of some political cause that you don't really care about, it seems like you're helping, it seems like you're being altruistic, but what you're really after is winning the recognition of being morally superior. When you splay your name on a building after donating money to your alma mater, it appears you're out $20 million, but you've been paid in a currency that's even more valuable. And here's something closer to enlightenment. Why do intellectuals write books? Well, it's because we want to live a good life and we want to spread our ideas. You don't need to write a book to do that. Socrates didn't write a book. Confucius, Jesus, Buddha. The great founders of the great intellectual traditions didn't write books. They were true philosophers. They were wise men. And they cared about living the good life, which is why they lived out their ideas like the Spartans and didn't just write books about them like the Athenians. And that act, being a moral exemplar, spread their ideas further than writing a book ever could. This is how Rousseau comments on his own contemporaries' book writing behavior. When their book was done and published, its content no longer interested them in any way, unless it were to make others adopt it and to defend it in case it were attacked. They drew nothing from it for living their lives, and were not even concerned whether this content was false or true, provided it was not refuted. What appears to be, again, an altruistic action, a desire to increase the frontiers of human knowledge, is often primarily a vessel for pride. As this example goes to show, the pride of the intellectual is going to be a lot more subtle, which is probably why the corruption from arts and sciences have flown under the radar. When the athlete hoists his championship trophy up in the air, when the capitalist displays his name on a building, when a general accepts surrender, that's obvious. But intellectual pride, its mechanisms, are a lot less obvious, but not for that reason any less intense. Rousseau thinks that what intellectual life consists in is studying man. And as a result, the intellectual sees through a lot of the lies, a lot of the pretty narratives we tell ourselves. For example, like how many altruistic actions are actually motivated by pride. And what this does for the intellectual is that it gives him a contempt for humanity and further elevate himself. He feels prideful because of his special knowledge. I think there's another reason we can add to Rousseau about why intellectual pride may seem a lot more intense than first meets the eye, because of the incredible lag in intellectual recognition. If you're not in the MBA by the time you're 25, if you're not a billionaire by the time you're 70, you're just not going to be a great athlete or a great capitalist. But Nietzsche could have lived his sane intellectual life in obscurity and still held on to the belief that future university departments will be set up to study his works. And Nietzsche would be right. Because of that incredible lag in intellectual recognition, it gives the intellectual a lot more room, a lot more imagination for their pride to grow. Now, pride is obviously prone to many abuses. And I think if you're not careful, you're going to end up like that Fight Club quote, buying things you don't need with money you don't have to impress people you don't like. But pride isn't something you can just easily renounce because of how strong and how central it is in the human motivational repertoire for Rousseau. I mean, to this day, I agree with Rousseau. I've not met a single person who's not primarily motivated by pride in some form. There was one guy in college who went around telling that he didn't care what other people thought of him. Of course, what he was actually saying is, please think of me as somebody who does not care what you think of me. So the question for Rousseau is not going to be, how do we stop caring what other people think, but what type of recognition to delight in. And Rousseau is very explicit. He wants to be honored, but only by a small handful of wise men, and not what he derogatorily calls the people. He wants his name to last hundreds of years and not just chase fashions and trends of the day. Now, even if there are ways to direct pride to shape it in a healthy manner, Rousseau thinks that there are many more ways of abuse. And the heart of Rousseau's critique of Enlightenment is about all the ways that pride goes wrong in intellectual life. So we've narrowed down the primary path of corruption. The first discourse is a meditation on how pride and intellect corrupt each other. But to be a bit more precise, we need to split intellect into two. I quote to you Rousseau. The sciences are the masterpiece of reason. The spirit of imitation has produced the fine arts. We will first examine how pride interacts with reason in his critique of science, and then we're going to examine how pride interacts with imitation in his critique of art. So when Rousseau says science, sometimes he means the natural sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, but more often than not, he means philosophy. And what he's critiquing in both instances is reason. The combination of reason and pride leads to the disease of contrarianism. I quote to you Rousseau. The first philosophers earned great renown by teaching men to perform their duties and the principles of virtue. But before long, these precepts had become commonplace, and in order to achieve distinction, men had to strike out in opposite directions. Such is the origin of the absurd systems of many philosophers. The likely failure mode for philosophy is when pride co-opts reason and takes it into difference for difference's sake. So here's an example of that. I went to a political conference a few weeks ago, and it just reaffirmed things that most people already agree with. Justice, equality, freedom. Most people loved it. My intellectual friends hated it. They thought it was vanilla, they thought it was boring, and they started pestering the senators with hot takes for sport. That's the issue with intellectuals, that they don't treat ideas as things to live by, as things to guide a life, but as primarily things to win distinction through. And the easiest way to win distinction is contrarianism, is through shock. So just as the fashionista looks down upon someone wearing last season's styles, the prideful philosopher is going to look down upon people with the majority view. And just as fashion is governed by what's in and what's out, Rousseau thinks so does intellectual life. And just as high fashion creates incredibly ugly pieces of clothing for shock, Rousseau thinks that many philosophers double down on completely outrageous opinions for the simple purpose of distinguishing themselves. But the issue with contrarianism isn't just that it's annoying or that it's stupid, but that it's an existential threat to the community. And he draws out why it's a threat, the vector of this threat, from his reading of the history of Christianity. So for Rousseau, God's chosen people, the Jews, started off like the Spartans. They were ignorant, they were uncultured, but they were virtuous. And what corrupted this tradition for Rousseau was Jewish legalism that culminated in the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Legalism for Rousseau was prideful and destructive because it elevated following an intricate man-made system of laws above following the principles of God. I mean, this is what Jesus was critiquing in Luke. When he goes to the Pharisees and he says, you guys have developed this intricate law of tithing. Okay, so tithing is when you give 1/10 of your large agricultural produce. You guys have extended that law to garden herbs. So you're counting mint leaves to make sure we're giving 1/10. But then all of God's teachings that can't be narrowed into this legalistic framework, like justice, like compassion, you guys just completely ignore. So for Rousseau, Jesus' message is an anti-intellectual one, designed precisely to combat this type of overgrowth of reason in religious life. Quote to you, Rousseau. Jesus Christ did not entrust his doctrine and ministry to scholars. There's not a single learned or scientific word to be found, lest it be to indicate his contempt for everything of that kind. After the death of Jesus Christ, 12 poor fishermen and artisans undertook to instruct and convert the world. Their method was simple. They preached artlessly, but with utter conviction. And of all the miracles with which God honored their faith, the most striking was the saintliness of their lives. The Pharisees are like the Athenians. They got a lot to say. They have a huge system of law to tell you what to do. Christ and his disciples are like the Spartans. They don't have a lot to say. And when they convince you, it's not through flashy rhetoric. It's through being moral exemplars. So early Christianity for Rousseau, just like early Judaism, started off ignorant but virtuous. But then reason reared its ugly head again with the introduction of Greek philosophy. I quote to you, Rousseau. Scholars constantly wanted to prove themselves cleverer than their predecessors. Every dogma became an occasion for hair-splitting. Everyone wanted to uphold his opinion. No one wanted to yield. The ambition to be the leader of a sect arose. Heresies proliferated on all sides. Now pay attention here to why Rousseau said people started hair-splitting. It wasn't because making distinctions was important for living a good and virtuous Christian life. It was because of contrarianism, that they wanted to defend uncommon positions, to stand out. So that's the psychological origin of the heresies for Rousseau. And that's how the early church got corrupted. And if you take a history of philosophy class, there's usually a 1,000-year gap between Augustine and Aquinas. And we usually go, Dark Ages, no philosophy, bad. But Rousseau goes, Dark Ages, no philosophy, great. Because even though Enlightenment leaving Europe did not uncorrupt the church, once you're corrupted, it at least gave the church some peace. This peace was broken for Rousseau by the Renaissance of the 14th century and something even more destructive, the printing press in the 15th century. The printing press allowed the Bible to be in the hands of not just the scholars, but also the people. Division, contrarianism, and heresy became democratized. The Protestant Reformation soon followed in the 16th century, and its central principle of sola scriptura, right, through scripture alone instead of relying on worldly authority or tradition, became a recipe for division. In the first 1500 years, the church had one great schism, the Catholics and the Orthodox. How many denominations of Protestantism are there in the first 500 years? Numerous as the stars, each with their theological hot take. This is why, when my Catholic friends make fun of my Protestant friends, they call them book worshippers. And eventually Rousseau thinks that starting a sect was no longer cool enough. It wasn't contrarian enough, that you had to become an atheist. So even atheism is a contrarian impulse. Now, the story of religion and reason for Rousseau is exactly the same as the story of civilization and reason, which is that reason causes division and chaos within a community because it leads this centrifugal force of trying to distance oneself. So whether that's Jewish legalism straying from God, Greek philosophy and the early heresies, or the printing press and the Protestant Reformation. Now, the reason Rousseau thinks this centrifugal force of contrarianism is so dangerous is because what makes a community is shared identity. It's shared values. It's common beliefs. It's the fact that we worship the same God. It's the fact that we speak the same language, that we have the same heroes. This foundational similarity is what is going to enable you to identify with your fellow citizens, to see your fellow citizens as, in some strong sense, me. In a diverse society like our own, Rousseau thinks at best we are elementary particles joined together by a thin wire of self-interest or legal force. I only help you insofar as it's going to profit me or I'm obliged to by the law. Philosophy and science, then, are going to be lethal to this social fabric, but not just because of contrarianism. Even rational inquiry itself, even philosophical inquiry, is deeply damaging to this set of shared identities. Why? Well, it's because there are a lot of false beliefs that also formed our shared identity. So, in other words, Rousseau is going to distinguish the usefulness of a belief from its truthfulness. There are a lot of false beliefs that also form a shared common identity. I think everyone will agree here that the Egyptian gods never existed. But I think we can also all agree that it would have been terrible if at the height of Egyptian civilization, half of them turned atheists. In Rousseau's case, he's going to point out a story with Cicero and Caesar. So Cicero berates Caesar for publicly denouncing the immortality of the soul, because Cicero thinks it's an important axiom of moral and political life. But Cicero expresses the same opinion, but just in private. And Rousseau praises Cicero. He doesn't think this is hypocritical, because Cicero did it to protect the state, not for his own sake. So the lesson here is that there are many wrong beliefs that are nonetheless helpful for a community that would be threatened by this type of rational inquiry. But most of our shared identities are not like that. They're not just straight up wrong, like the Egyptian gods, and we can give good reasons for them. But even these things, it's very dangerous to subject them to rational inquiry. Why is that? Just because you can give reasons for something does not mean it is grounded on reason. So why marriage? Why have children? Well, there are many reasons that we can give both for and against that. But that doesn't mean it's grounded in a sort of deductive, QED, rational certainty. Furthermore, a lot of our shared identities are just completely arbitrary, like the color of the flag. So when you start opening these things up to rational inquiry, like why white, red, and blue? Why should we have children? Why should we get married? You're going to open yourself up to many vectors of valid attack. And Rousseau thinks that in the realm of ideas, attack is going to always be easier than defense. Now, there are a small set of beliefs in political life that Rousseau thinks you can get to this kind of rational, deductive QED certainty, right? Principles of political right. So an example would be the government should serve the interests of the people, the will of the people, or the will of the entire state, and not just of the government. But even these things, it's dangerous to subject to rational inquiry. Because just because something can be fully grounded on reason doesn't mean people will be successful in doing so. The assumption that you should have going in, and the assumption that Rousseau has going in, is that most people suck at reasoning. So if you open this thing up, you're going to get contrarian philosophers who are trying to peddle some weird theory. You're going to get opportunists who say things that are seemingly plausible, like, well, but the government should serve its own needs first, because that's how you're going to get the best people in government. And suddenly, you've opened up a monstrous debate in your community. I think there's an even stronger point to be made here, which is that merely begging the question, merely asking the question, why get married? Why have children? Already shows that that custom has lost its force. Because we don't beg the question for things that are completely obvious. We don't ask, why do we walk on our feet and not our hands? And Rousseau thinks that in the ideal state, we're talking about the good state, the ideal state here, its laws, its customs should all have that obvious nature. Okay, so those are all things we got to do to protect good morals, good beliefs, good customs, even if they're not true. What about bad morals? I quote to you Rousseau. The slightest change in customs, even if it is in some respects for the better, invariably proves destructive to morals, for the people ceases to respect them. In a good state, it's dangerous even to challenge customs that are bad, because it calls the entire set into question. For beliefs, customs, and morals to have their maximum force, they need to seem obvious, they need to seem eternal, they need to seem objective. This is why Rousseau's ideal states are all small and incredibly homogeneous republics. I quote to you Rousseau. If I were the leader of Niger, I would have a gallows erected at the country's border, where I would hang without appeal the first European who dared to enter it and the first citizen who ventured to leave it. The immigrant is dangerous because he introduces foreign ideas, values, and customs that at the very least makes us question our own. The emigrant is dangerous because he sets up an example of abandoning the community. Now, I gotta be clear so we don't go overboard here. This doesn't mean no change, no debate, no free speech. In fact, there are going to be some spheres where it's not just healthy, but necessary to have debate. What Rousseau is saying, that when it comes to these fundamental shared identities, there is a massive cost to begging the question, to opening them up to rational inquiry. So let me give you a modern example that's going to tie all this together. The American Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The existence of this lectern is self-evident. Cogito ergo sum, that's self-evident, at least for Descartes. Are these rights self-evident? And if they were, why would we need to hold them to be? They just would be. But here's the even stronger point. Many Americans aren't even Christian anymore. And fewer still abide by this type of natural right thinking that leads to this type of language. I would be willing to bet anything that less than 1% of Americans have rationally grounded this belief in unalienable rights through reason. But I think we can all agree that it's a great thing that all Americans believe in it. And it's an even better thing that there is no public debate about whether they exist or not. So I hope you can understand now why Rousseau thought that the Enlightenment rationalists of his day, the people who were subject everything to rational inquiry, were people who were truly dogmatic, intolerant, and sectarian. They're dogmatic because they want to ground everything on reason, but not everything can be grounded on reason. They're intolerant because most things can be successfully attacked by reason, at least in the public's eye. And they're sectarian because they're selective of what they attack. They attack things they don't like to advance their own interests. Okay, so that's why not just contrarianism, but even rational inquiry, even philosophizing itself, is dangerous to the community. We're now going to move on and explore a slightly different issue with science, which is that it's useless and that it legitimizes an idle life. I quote to you Rousseau. Answer me then, illustrious philosophers, you to whom we owe it to know in what ratios bodies attract one another in a vacuum, which curves have conjugate points, which have inflection points, and which cusps. How man sees everything in God, how there is correspondence without communication between soul and body, what stars may be inhabited, what insects reproduce in an uncommon way. If you had never taught us any of these things, would we have been any the less numerous for it, any the less well-governed, the less formidable, the less flourishing, or the more perverse? I think in Rousseau's day, the right answer was no. Science was pretty darn useless. That has changed. That has completely changed since Rousseau's time. And we're going to spend the third part of this lecture just on unpacking what technology means for the arguments in the first discourse. But even today, I think Rousseau's arguments can help us see that there is so much useless intellectual activity. I mean, go look at the list of majors in a college catalog, and you tell me how many of them you think are useful. Here's a hint. If a discipline feels compelled to append science or studies to its name, it's probably overcompensating for a deficiency in both. And what you learn in those fields is what the best scholars are producing. Rousseau wants to ask, what is everyone else producing? And so even today, there's a lot of wasted resources, a lot of navel-gazing. And I think that caricature of the French intellectual is still all too common. Oui, oui, monsieur. But does this work in theory? Now, the other point in Rousseau's critique of science's idleness that is still relevant today is that intellectuals, even if what they do is useful, they don't do it because it's useful. They do it because it's fun, because they enjoy it, because they have great pleasure in doing it. And so Rousseau wants you to start seeing intellectual activity not like a public service, but as a private indulgence. So when my friends want to go to grad school, it's mostly because they want to read books. It's not because they want to save the world. I'm doing this lecture series for great reason, because I just gained great pleasure from reading these books very carefully. I mean, my friends who had the misfortune of being my roommates observed that I make the exact same noises when I read something interesting as when I eat something tasty. I go, mmm. And that, I think, is what Rousseau wants you to see intellectuals as closer to the glutton than Mother Teresa. And in the same way, a society does not elevate the gluttonous life. Rousseau is wary about elevating the intellectual life, because that would be elevating and justifying a life of idleness, a life of satisfying private pleasures and not contributing to the community. Okay. So those are his critiques of science, reason, and philosophy. Contrarianism, rational inquiry destroying the social fabric, and idleness. Now let me be clear here so we don't go overboard. Reason is going to be necessary for the cultivation of virtue. Okay, so the Spartan citizen is going to have to reason. That doesn't mean subject everything to rational inquiry. That also doesn't mean that kids have to be trained through science and philosophy. There's a lot of ways to train one's reason. Board games. Language itself trains you in the ways of reason. I also want to be clear that Rousseau thinks science and philosophy are things good in themselves. In the hands of the right people, small group of elite wise men, people like Socrates, Rousseau thinks that the results are both beautiful and spectacular. But the issue is, most of us are not Socrates. That's why you can't build a society grounded on reason. Here's the calculus. All of us, if we're in the state of nature, can be naturally good. Why? Because human nature for Rousseau is good. All of us can live in Sparta and have the potential, have the capacity to be a virtuous citizen, because our ability to imitate heroes is very strong. But in Enlightenment society, there will only be a few, if there are any at all, Socrates. Most of the people are going to fall prey to contrarianism, they're going to fall prey to partial truths, they're going to fall prey to paralyzing skepticism. And if I still haven't hammered home just how impotent the faculty of reason is, I will just remind you that what makes these wise men, Socrates, what makes the wise men wise, their constitutive quality, is that they recognize the limitations of their reason, that they recognize their own ignorance. I quote to you Rousseau. Only in a very few men of genius does insight into their own ignorance grow as they learn, and they are the only ones for whom study may be good. Almost as soon as small minds have learned something, they believe they know everything, and there's no sort of foolishness which this conviction will not make them say or do. And so, the real target of Rousseau's critique of Enlightenment is popular Enlightenment. It's spreading knowledge too far, which is interesting because we tend to think of Rousseau as an egalitarian thinker, right? As a democratic egalitarian thinker. But I'll remind you that Rousseau's arguments against popular Enlightenment does proceed through the egalitarian democratic tradition. Rousseau isn't Nietzsche in his Untimely Meditations, attacking Enlightenment because he wants to create a culture for the elite, right, to produce these higher men. Rousseau attacks popular Enlightenment precisely because it's incompatible with the common man. Rousseau also isn't Plato, who attacked the intellectuals of his day, who tried to use a system of noble lies to build an aristocracy. Rousseau's concern with popular Enlightenment is that the rationalization of society is precisely what destroys the possibility of democratic will formation. Democratic will formation can only happen in genuine communities where you identify with the other person, where you have shared identities, identities which science and rational inquiry threatens. And so, his critique of science is precisely that it's incompatible with democratic will formation. But that's just wrong, right? What about modern democracies that also push science? I think Rousseau would say, we're not truly democratic. And you can see that by the metaphor, by the way we conceive of how democracy works. We think about it as negotiation. I come to the table ready to argue for my side, what I want. You come to the table with your side. And then we compromise, we meet in the middle. For Rousseau, true democratic will formation is about each citizen arguing for what he or she thinks is best for the entire community. So the process is not one of tug of war, it's not one of negotiation, but it's one of information. Different citizens will have different vantage points and different ideas about what is good, but again, for the whole community. But to be able to argue for the whole community, you need to identify with the whole community. And that identification is precisely what rational inquiry threatens. This is why I think Rousseau's critique of Enlightenment is so valuable for us, because he's speaking to us and he shows us how science threatens the democratic values and institutions that matter to us. And I think this also helps us understand why he's so critical of things like the printing press. Because it lowers the barrier to be an intellectual, it pushes enlightenment on people who can't handle it, and it immortalizes bad authors. For Rousseau, popular media is bad media. Think about the average book before the printing press. Think about the average book after the printing press. Think about your average self-published book. Think about your average YouTube video, and think about your average tweet. The more democratized a medium is, the worse it's going to get. In summary then, science and philosophy are things good in themselves, just not in the hands of what Rousseau derogatorily calls the people. In the hands of the people, reason combines with pride to create contrarianism that rips the social fabric of the community apart. Reason combines with self-interest to create factions that rips the material fabric of the community. But the real danger of science is its second-order effects on society, when you apply the mode of a rational inquiry to examine the shared identities of a state. Such examination turns people into elementary particles that are held together by only self-interest and the threat of force. A rational society is simply not a society. So that's Rousseau's critique of science. We're now going to move on to his critique of art. If the threat of science is that it pushes people apart, the issue with art is that it's going to bring people together, but in all the wrong ways. If science alienates us, then art is going to over-socialize us. And it does so because the essence of art is imitation. The question is, imitation of what? Now, the classical view saw art as imitating nature. Closer the imitation, better the art. And so a hierarchy formed. Painting, you can basically get a photorealistic copy of the original thing. Sculpture, a bit more limited on what you can imitate. Poetry, you can imitate with words. Music, you can barely imitate anything. Rousseau is going to flip that hierarchy on its head by suggesting that art is not the imitation of nature, but the imitation of feeling. And suddenly, music is at the top. Music, Rousseau thinks, can directly incite feeling. You can't listen to Beethoven's Fifth without feeling energized in a certain way. Think about certain songs and tunes that are just able to get you into a certain mood. Poetry can also incite feeling. It's a little bit worse than music, but it can do that. Sculpture is static, it's very hard. Painting is even harder still. So Rousseau's theory of art was quite influential, and not only did it flip this hierarchy of art, it is also who we partially have to thank or perhaps to blame for modern art. And it's turn away from realism to expressivism, right? It's turn away from the external world to the internal world. So art is the imitation of feeling. What's wrong with that? Well, that means that art is impotent at doing, or it rarely does, what artists claim it can do, which is moral improvement. Remember, it's rare for philosophy to morally improve people because it takes people too far astray. Art has the opposite issue. Art does not take people far enough. Because art is the imitation of feeling, you need to imitate feelings that are already there in the culture if you want to get any resonance. So take music and its ability to sort of incite feeling that we just discussed. Rousseau thinks that that's deeply culturally dependent. So a childhood tune that you grew up listening to that can bring you tears of nostalgia every time it plays could be completely meaningless for someone on the other side of the world. Or take this lecture, for example. I'm able to lead you through reason, I hope, pretty far from your original starting assumptions, right? That science and art are just unilaterally good. And that's also why reason is very dangerous, because it can lead you astray. But if instead of this lecture, I just showed you a short film of the Caliph Omar burning the Library of Alexandria as the good guy, you're just going to be confused. And Rousseau had a similar problem here when he was writing a novel about the death of Lucretia. So Lucretia was a noblewoman. She was raped, she committed suicide, and it started the rebellion that culminated in the founding of the Roman Republic. And midway through writing this novel, Rousseau realized that no one was going to be able to relate to this example at all. So he changed it, and the novel eventually became Julie. Okay? So Julie is about a modern woman. She also loses her virginity, but it's not through rape, but seduction. She's not strong-willed, but she has a beautiful soul. And because Julie was relatable, it was a huge success. Now, Julie is also an important example here because Julie did successfully change our moral habits. Rousseau is, again, who we have to partially thank or blame for introducing love rather than familial connection as the basis of marriage. So it is possible to change morals with art, but only through these small nudging movements. When the lesson you have to teach is too far from the audience's existing morals, you're just going to land on deaf ears. And I think the best example of this is the modern invention of Monopoly. So the real and forgotten inventor of Monopoly, the board game, was an anti-monopolist activist called Elizabeth Magie. And she, in her original game, there were two sets of rules. One set was an anti-capitalist set, where victory, the goal of the game, was communal. It was a communal victory. And the other set is the set that we know and love today, where you fleece people alive for profit. And she made the game to be a pedagogical tool to show that the anti-capitalist system is a lot better than the capitalist one. The game did not pick up, except for in a group of left-wing intellectuals that already agreed with the principles that she was trying to teach. And this guy, Richard Darrow, comes along. He bootlegs the game. He cuts out the anti-capitalist side. He calls it Monopoly. It spreads like wildfire. And the game ends up making billions upon billions of dollars. And the irony is, Maggie's game gets monopolized by Darrow's game, and she gets paid only $500, and she dies in obscurity with no recognition for her contributions. This, Rousseau reminds us, is the fate of the artist who tries to paddle too hard against the current. I quote to you Rousseau, "If by chance someone among the men of extraordinary talents or steadfast of soul and refused to yield to the currents of his century, he will die in poverty and oblivion. So even if you have pedagogy as your dominant aim, you're probably still going to fail at teaching people lessons. But most artists, Rousseau thinks, do not have pedagogy as their main aim. What are artists after? The same thing that the philosophers are after, to gratify their pride. And if the philosopher best satisfies his pride through hot takes and contrarianism, then the artist best satisfies his pride by pleasing people, by inciting the most cathartic and addictive feelings in his audience. Rousseau thinks that more often than not, artists are out to give their audience a space to simulate emotion without any of the responsibilities. So he thinks that even tyrants weep in tragedy because there's no emotional cost to art, right? It's just emotion without consequence. When you watch a movie, you can indulge in pride without the corresponding achievement. You can experience pity without aid. You can revel in anger without action. So what pretends to be moral art, more often than not, are mostly masturbatory acts. It's masturbatory for the creator to get prestige and applauded for voicing the majority opinion. And it's masturbatory for the audience so they feel morally smug without having to do anything. So take something like Avatar, right, whose creator explicitly had an environmentalist aim. We can go watch that movie and all say, well, those colonialist, polluting bastards sure are evil. We pat ourselves in the back and we drive home in our gasoline-guzzling cars. And Rousseau thinks that moral messages in art are impotent without the corresponding political structure and system around it. Because the very structure of the modern theater is isolating. You go to the theater, the light dims, you're teleported to another world. The thing is about some fantasy land, light years away in the case of Avatar. The light comes back on, and you're back to reality. And it's this precise isolation between reality and art, which is what is preventing art from having its maximum pedagogical force. So when we talk about positive solutions later on, this is something that Rousseau is going to try to fix by making life itself artistic. But the key thing here to already take away is that what determines the impact of art, whether it's effective or it's impotent, is not just on the art itself, but it's the circumstances around which people ingest that art. So the example that Rousseau gives is that he thinks novels have a greater force of changing their readers when people read it in the countryside and not in big cities, because the social force of the big city is too viscous to be conducive to change. Okay, so that's the beginning of the critique, that art, while it pretends to be moral, is usually impotent. It doesn't make us better. But Rousseau is going to push that argument a lot further. Not only does art not make us better, it usually makes us a lot worse. Because it's really hard to make art that is both edifying and popular. Moral lessons are boring. And it's not just as simple as the good guy surviving and the bad guy dying. I mean, on one hand, you can't make the villain seem too one-dimensional. On the other hand, you can't make them seem too cool and worthy of imitation. On one hand, you've got to really desire to edify, to teach your audience a lesson. But on the other hand, you can't let that desire show forth. I mean, think about overtly political messages in movies and how that's an immediate turnoff. So unless you're a great talent like Rousseau, he thinks that you're going to have to choose between popularity and edification. And because of pride, artists choose popularity. They resort to cheap tricks to please the audience, and they incite feelings, not the feelings that will morally improve his audience, but the feelings that will get them addicted to come back. I mean, just look at social media, right? They have legions of the world's top psychologists trying to manipulate your feelings, fear, anger, lust, to try to get you to come back and use their platform. Or think about something like reality TV. Whatever the show ostensibly is about, finding love, buying houses, that's just the excuse, right? That's just the backdrop for the real subject, which is the drama itself. It's pettiness, it's envy. So the same rule then for philosophy is true for art. Popular art is bad art. To summarize the argument so far, Art does not make you more moral, and it often makes you a lot worse. But the real danger of art, as is the case with science, is the second-order effects that it brings to a society. In the case of art, that's deception. And I think I can tease this out with an anecdote. So I was just visiting LA, and I had a friend there who had it as a goal of hers to marry an actor. And I said, why in the world would you want to marry an actor? They deceive people for a living. She thought I was crazy. So I felt somewhat emboldened to read that Rousseau agreed with me. I quote to you Rousseau. What is the talent of the actor? It is the art of counterfeiting himself, of appearing different than he is, of becoming passionate in cold blood, of saying what he does not think as naturally as if he really did. What is the profession of the actor? It is a trade in which he performs for money, submits himself to the disgrace and the affronts that others buy the right to give him, and puts his person publicly on sale. I beg every sincere man to tell, if he does not feel in the depths of his soul that there is something servile and base in this traffic of oneself. Now let me be clear here. Rousseau isn't saying that all actors are bad people. In fact, he said that if you meet a good actor, you should give them extra praise for them staying good despite being an actor. Rousseau's first major worry is that actors are going to use their skill set of deception outside the theater, for example, in the domain of marriage, and so you can't really trust these people. The second and greater concern is a community with actors among them will normalize the behavior of being one way and appearing another. So what's going to happen, Rousseau wants to ask, when a culture's major idols are actors and actresses? What's going to happen to a citizenry when people care more about tabloid gossip than local politics? What's going to happen to our children when they don't aspire to be honest professions, but instead aspire to be influencers and actors? That is the root of Rousseau's worry, and that is what has happened already in America. The claim is, and I think it's quite a plausible one, that a community without actors would have a sort of rustic, if albeit a bit brutish, but simplicity. And a community with actors normalizes deception and people-pleasing, right? Think about the culture of Los Angeles as shaped by Hollywood. Appearing rather than being. That is the logic of acting, but it's also the logic of art, right? It's about imitation. And that principle, Rousseau, he's continued to elaborate on what the second-order impacts are, is going to introduce two more dangerous forces in society: luxury and politeness. So the relationship between luxury and art is quite similar to the relationship between idleness and science. A society needs to have some surplus wealth already in order to create art. And art creates further status symbols for the wealthy. Think about it like this. If popular art is about getting us addicted, is about teasing our bad emotions, what about high art? Is that to edify us? Is that for the appreciation of beauty? Rousseau would say it's to use the excuse of appreciation of beauty to show off your wealth. I mean, you can't just stack gold bars in the living room of your mansion, but you can say, here's my Picasso. You can't buy out a banner in New York saying I'm obscenely rich, but if you pay enough money to the Met, they're going to carve your name on the side of the building. So that connection between art and luxury is going to be very easy to see. But there's a deeper relationship, which is that art and luxury share the same form, imitation. What is the logic of art? It's to appear other than what one is, right? The painting of the mountain is not the mountain. What is the logic of luxury? It's to appear more valuable than one is, right? Kanye's $300 t-shirts, I hate to break it to you, are not worth $300. For Rousseau, the definition of luxury is an unnecessary good that has become necessary, either through prestige or habituation. So luxury goods are, by definition, goods that are more useless than they appear or are valued to be. So the concern for luxury is the same as the concern for idleness, right? That a society dedicated to it is a society dedicated to useless things. But not only do luxuries try to appear other than what it is, it also helps its owners appear other than who they are. An example that Rousseau gives here is of luxury clothes. So Rousseau says there's nothing wrong with luxurious clothes, but like science, it's how most people relate with it. The first issue that comes to mind is that most people use luxury clothes to hide some kind of deformity. So you don't have a great physique, and you're just paying money to cover it up. On the other hand, the good man, Rousseau tells us, is an athlete who delights in fighting naked. Second of all, Rousseau says we spend way too much of our time and money on fashion, that the highlight of our year is the buying of a purse or a suit, and such a person dedicates his entire life, right, to uselessness. That's the concern. So that's luxury. But an artistic culture, a culture where pleasing people is held in esteem, also develops an even greater problem, and that's politeness. That's a conformist culture that is afraid of offending people. But the conformism here isn't the good type of conformism, right, where you genuinely have a huge set of shared values. It's a form of pretending to agree. It's a surface level conformism. I quote to you Rousseau, "A vile and deceiving uniformity prevails in our morals, and all minds seem to have been cast in the same mold. Constantly, politeness demands, propriety commands. Constantly, one follows custom, never one's own genius. One no longer dares to appear what one is. One will thus never really know with whom one is dealing. In order to know one's friend, one will therefore have to wait for great occasions. That is, to wait until it is too late." I immediately thought of California when I read this quote. You know, when I was a kid, I thought what a good person was. I thought California, because they're smiling all the time. They're so happy. And they use superlatives whenever they see you. You're the best, right? This is the best party I've ever been to. And when I was a kid, when I thought bad person, I thought New Yorker, right? We're mean. We brush people off in the subway. We're also busy and competitive the whole time. But of course, as I got older, it became obvious that most Californians were just as mean and competitive as the New Yorkers, but they just smile when they do it. Now, Rousseau's opponents, who are going to try to defend this type of hypocritical, polite culture, often cite La Rochefoucauld's famous maxim, right? That hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue. So the idea here is that a polite but hypocritical culture like California is better than an honest but mean culture like New York, because at least you're forcing the hypocrite to admit what the good values are. And maybe one day they'll transform. This is Rousseau's response. "Would a thief dressed up in the livery of the house in order to do his mischief more easily ever be said to be paying homage to the master of the house he robs? No, it is to add cowardice and imposture to all the other vices." Hypocrisy isn't the homage that vice pays to virtue. It's just another vice. So you have your original set of vices, and now you're also hypocritical. But the problem deepens. I continue quoting Rousseau. "Hypocrisy is to shut oneself off forever from any possible return to virtue. There are lofty characters who bring even to crime something proud and generous, which reveals that they still have left in them some spark of that celestial fire made to animate beautiful souls. But the vile and groveling soul of the hypocrite is like a corpse without fire or warmth or vitality left. Great villains have been known to return into themselves, end their life wholesomely, and die saved. But no one has ever known a hypocrite becoming a good man." This is the real issue with hypocrisy, that hypocrisy prevents the hypocritical from being reformed. And the reason is that what hypocrisy is, what art is, seeming rather than being, splits your soul into two. And if you live constantly in this two-faced way, you're going to end up forgetting who even you yourself are. And you're not going to have the strength that comes from a unified soul. So to continue the California example, last time I went to San Francisco, I drove into the city. And within literally an hour of driving into the city, my car got broken into, okay? I mean, whenever I travel, I do pride myself in living like a local. In San Francisco's case, In the first half of 2023, it had 11,000 crimes of car break-ins. There were 45 convictions in total. Why? Well, because dealing with crime is not nice. It's not very pleasing to criminals when you arrest them. So when you have officials who have been brought up in a culture to please, they aren't going to even have the strength of soul to maintain the bare minimum of the law. So again, politeness, manners themselves are not the issue. It's the over-socialization of certain communities that saps the strength of its citizens' souls, that pushes problems aside for peaceability until it's too late. That's the issue. So in summary then, art is just as existentially threatening to the good community as science, but the direction of the threat comes from the exact opposite direction. Science undermines the best parts of society. Art enhances the worst parts. Science breaks the bounds of society, whereas art pulls us together, but in all the wrong ways. It introduces hypocrisy and luxury, two paths of over-socialization, and it pretends to make people moral, while often making people much worse. Now, for Rousseau, science and art clearly are not the only cause of corruption. In fact, they're not even the first cause. Luxury, idleness, they had to have existed prior for even art and science to take place. But art and science are so intertwined with all the other evils of civilization. That is what leads Rousseau to conclude that our souls have been corrupted in proportion to their advance. This corruption of the soul can be summarized as a good inequality giving way to a bad inequality. A hierarchy of virtue giving way to a hierarchy of talent. I quote to you Rousseau. We have physicists, geometricians, chemists, astronomers, poets, musicians, painters. We no longer have citizens. This is why Enlightenment causes corruption. This is why Enlightenment causes collapse, and why Enlightenment is not just the best friend of the foreign conqueror, but also the domestic tyrant. Quote to you Rousseau one more time. The sciences, letters, and arts, less despotic than the threat of physical force and perhaps more powerful, spread garlands of flowers over the iron chains with which they are laden, throttle in the people the sentiment of that original freedom for which they seemed born, make them love their slavery, and fashion them to what is called civilized peoples. So that's part one. And we have our full answer to the question, how could Rousseau critique Enlightenment? But an even more interesting and perplexing question raises itself. How could Rousseau critique Enlightenment? Because who was Jean-Jacques Rousseau? He wasn't Marcus Aurelius, writing a personal diary as meditations, not intending it to be published. He wasn't Socrates, who didn't bother writing anything at all. He wasn't Diogenes, who told Alexander to get out of his son. Rousseau wrote philosophical tomes that influenced people like Nietzsche, like Robespierre, like Kant. His novel, Julie, was one of the most important novels of the 18th century. He put on plays in the very theater that he attacked. And he himself contributed to the democratization of knowledge by participating and helping Diderot with his encyclopedia. Even more damning, Rousseau is clearly driven by the pride that he criticizes. As a young man, he made a fake aristocratic name for himself so that people would take him more seriously. He created a system of musical notation, hoping it would make him famous. And he published the first Discourse. It was a public essay contest held by a prestigious academy, which he won first prize in, that propelled him to intellectual celebrity. But the problem is even worse for Rousseau, because it's not like the first Discourse was the end of his literary output. You know, he was a changed man. I've realized philosophy and art is bad. I've stopped doing my stuff. The first Discourse was the beginning of his literary output. And he himself says that the first Discourse is the origin of his philosophical system, that it contains the key intuitions that would be the backbone of his major works later on. His critique of contemporary education morphed into a meal. his meditations on democratic will formation became the social contract, and his attack on inequality as well as civilization became the famous Second Discourse. So given all this, I wouldn't fault you for reacting to the first discourse in the exact same way that almost all of Rousseau's contemporaries reacted to it. I quote to you Voltaire. "You have cried out against the sciences and cultivated the sciences. You have treated authors and philosophers as charlatans. And to prove this by means of an example, you have been an author. You've written against the theatre with the devotion of a Capuchin monk, and you have composed bad plays." Is Rousseau not the very contrarian philosopher who's attacking the popular moral of erudition for fame, for notoriety? Is he not the very hypocritical artist who says he dislikes Enlightenment and then becomes Enlightenment's greatest exemplar? I think Rousseau is both of those things, and he admits it. But he's not just those things. There is a way to largely make consistent Rousseau's own literary output with his critique of Enlightenment, which hinges on one central insight. What is to be done in the good state is not what is to be done in the bad state that has already been corrupted by Enlightenment. So take his critique of theaters and actors. That was specifically addressed to Geneva. Geneva did not have a public theater at the time. Geneva, relatively, was like Sparta. Okay? It was much more rustic, it was much more simple. And that's why a theater would be bad for them. Where Rousseau put on plays, Rousseau's Paris, he conceived that to have already been so thoroughly corrupted that another play not only would not hurt, but it would also help in the following way. Theater can be a distraction so that people don't go and do worse things. Rousseau says if he puts on a popular play and he gets people, everyone in the city, to watch it for 2 hours, he's going to reduce crime in Paris by 1/12. I quote to you Rousseau. "Let's seek to make a wise diversion and try to deceive their passions. Let's offer some food to these tigers so they do not devour our children." What this made me think of, I'm a big NBA fan, was when I was watching a lot of interviews with these NBA players about why they played so much basketball growing up. And a common thing I heard was, my father always told me, if I was on the court, it meant I was out of trouble. If the alternative to basketball is crime, go play basketball. Okay, go play basketball all day, every day. But just because in that situation, basketball is a good solution does not mean an education with just playing basketball is the right education. Just because the theater is good for Paris does not mean that the theater is good. It means that Paris is bad. Okay, so that's the theater. And it's the same thing with academies, which is the equivalent of our research universities. Rousseau also suggests that academies can serve at least two positive roles in a corrupt Enlightenment society. The first one is to educate the wicked. The people are already corrupt. You're probably not going to make them worse. There's a small chance you're going to make them better, at least to do less crime. The other one is that academies can be a place to quarantine intellectuals so they don't spread their Enlightenment further. So in Sparta, don't set up academies, okay? It's going to lead to all the issues that we talked about in the political sphere. But in a society where many people are already corrupted and where there are a lot of people who aspire to be intellectuals, then set up academies to keep them away from the population. So the ivory tower serves two roles. One is that it flatters the pride of the intellectuals who are up there, and they can look at the people and say, we're so much better. For the people, it's a jail cell. Okay, it's a way to keep the crazies at bay. And what is true for academies and the theater is also going to be true for the printing press. It can also be co-opted, right, to combat its negative effects. One of the major negative effects of the printing press is that it immortalized the works of bad authors, people like Hobbes, Rousseau thinks. Now, the solution to that is that Rousseau publishes his own works to the printing press. Those works will also be immortalized. So the antidote to the bad effects of the printing press will also be always with us. I think the Rousseauian lesson here is that if you care about changing lives, impacting lives, and not just producing disembodied ideas, then you need to meet people where they are, even if that place is corrupt. So just because most of the content on social media is junk does not mean serious intellectuals shouldn't post on social media. In fact, it probably means they should post on there better stuff, and more importantly, to warn people of the junk. I quote to you Rousseau, "If someone came to kill me, and I had the good fortune to seize his weapon, would I be forbidden to use it to drive him off before I threw it away?" As you can see here, Rousseau's solutions to Enlightenment are all going to be very modest, right? Despite praising Constantinople for destroying their printing press, despite praising the Caliph Omar for burning the Library of Alexandria, Rousseau explicitly rejects both prescriptions. And Rousseau's solutions are all about how to live with Enlightenment. So despite being considered, I think rightfully conceived, the father of the French Revolution, despite thinking a revolution is the only thing that's going to turn back the negative impacts of moral corruption through Enlightenment, Rousseau is explicitly against revolution in this domain. I quote to you Rousseau, "Some great revolution is almost as much to be feared as the evil it might cure. It is blameworthy to desire and impossible to foresee." Now, why is desire such a revolution blameworthy? There's at least 4 reasons I can think of. The first one is that there's great cost to revolution. The second one is that revolution can make things a lot worse. The third reason is that even if revolution makes states better, the better state with new laws does not have the weight of tradition and history to its side. Remember what we talked about in shared identity and customs. These customs need to have the weight of history and tradition. Rousseau explicitly says in the second discourse, he would not want to live in a state that had just been freed from tyranny, because slaves have a very grotesque understanding of freedom. So it takes a long time for people to adapt to being freed. Now, lastly, I think there's a contingent reason for why revolution, specifically in this domain, is very difficult, which is that, unlike a tyrant, which you can kill, Enlightenment, I mean, it's very hard to put it back in a box. When Enlightenment leaves a society, think back to the Dark Ages, usually you don't return to ignorant virtue. Usually you just go to ignorant vice. And I think a tragic example of an anti-intellectual revolution here was Cambodia in the 70s. So its leader, Pol Pot, was born in Cambodia, studied in France, huge Rousseau fan. He saw in Cambodia's farmers an exemplar of Rousseau's noble savage. And he had a 4-year nationwide purge of intellectuals. He killed a quarter in 4 years of his country's entire population. Clergy, priests, lawyers, anyone who was wearing glasses was just killed on sight. Needless to say, an agrarian paradise, right, a Rousseauian golden age did not emerge. So given these 2 foundational beliefs, that Enlightenment causes irreversible corruption, and that the only way to reverse this would be a blameworthy revolution, I think we can be a lot more sympathetic to why Rousseau fully participates in the Enlightenment that he criticizes. He participates in it insofar to push back its growth and to curb its excesses. Specifically, I think Rousseau thinks that an intellectual in his shoes, in his time and his place, could do 4 things. The first one is preservation, right? Keep people like Geneva from getting a theater. The second one is distraction, putting plays in Paris. The third one is minor edification, slightly improving people, like with Julie, and love rather than familial connection being the basis of marriage. The last one is preparation. Rousseau still held out hope, however small, that there would be a morally pure people in the future. And he did right for that group. And so that's what we're going to explore now, which is the role of art and philosophy in the good state, in the ideal state. Now, you might think that the issue with art, philosophy, science is that they're too prestigious, right? They're too powerful. But the trick to aligning both of them actually is about giving them more power and more prestige. but in the right ways. So Athenian theater, compared to our movies, is both more prestigious, it's both culturally more powerful, but also a step in the right direction. It's a step in the right direction, for one, because publicly funded, not privately funded. It's done in a beautiful open-air theater and not a cramped, isolated, dark space. It's open to all the citizenry and not just closed off to ticket holders. Its prize is primarily public prestige and recognition and not private money. And because of this, it does not become a luxury in the way that modern theater has. Now, there's another key reason why Athenian theater is better than ours, which is that it is by Greeks, for Greeks, about Greeks. It's not about some alien superhero like Avatar, light years away. It's deeply connected with the society. The Oresteia, right, the famous tragedy, for example, is about the origins of the Athenian judicial system. But Athens, as we know, already corrupted. It's still theater. Okay? We can still do better. And we can still do better by making art even more powerful, even more prestigious, by making political life itself artistic. I quote to you Rousseau. In the modern age, men no longer have a hold on one another except by force or by self-interest. The ancients, by contrast, acted much more by persuasion and by the affections of the soul because they did not neglect the language of signs. He's going to explain what he means. It was in the gods' presence that individuals made their treaties and alliances and uttered their promises. He's talking about the institution of the oath. The face of the earth was the book in which their archives were preserved. Stones, trees, heaps of rocks, consecrated by these acts and thus made respectable to barbaric men, were the pages of this book. The faith of men was much more assured by the guarantee of these mute witnesses than it is today by all the vain rigor of the laws. He's talking about how this superstitious tradition of oath-keeping is much more effective than what we have today with laws and contracts. For Rousseau, society is either governed by persuasion, rhetoric, poetry, myth, music, or by coercion. Self-interest and the threat of physical force. It's never governed primarily, it's not grounded on rationality for the reasons that we just explored. Which means, as a ruler, you either have to win people's hearts or you have to chain their bodies. What doesn't work is appealing to their minds. So when we tell ourselves, modern society, when we tell ourselves we've moved from a persuasive, right, an artistic culture to a rational society by destroying superstitions like making an oath in front of a tree stub, what we're actually going is from a persuasive culture to a coercive culture. When we give up superstitions like oaths, we don't just rationally stick to our word, right? And rationality is not that strong. We need laws now. We need the threat of state violence backing up the contract. That's what makes us keep our word. And this shift from persuasion to coercion also happens with political authority as well. I quote you Rousseau. The august display of a royal power used to impress the subjects. Marks of dignity, a throne, a scepter, a purple robe, a crown, a diadem, were sacred things for them. These respected signs made the man who was thus adorned venerable to them. Without soldiers, without threats, he was obeyed as soon as he spoke. Now that we make an affectation of abolishing these signs, kings no longer make themselves obeyed, except by the dint of troops. The respect of subjects comes only from the fear of punishment. The modern state only knows how to speak in terms of rewards and punishments. Ancient states, ancient communities spoke in the language of signs. They were artistic. Political life itself was artistic. Rousseau points to the example, for example, of Moses, who enveloped Jewish law in music. Right? Psalms literally meant song. He points to the beautiful Quranic chants of Islam, and he points to how in ancient Greek, they enveloped their entire traditions in song and epic. The ancient Greek word for tune is the same as for law, nomos. These are all examples of how art can cease to be impotent and hypocritical by being woven into the very fabric of social political life and not just isolated in dark theaters as they exist today. Now, Rousseau's examples here seem terribly incompatible with the modern world. What are we supposed to do? I mean, turn the American Constitution into a Broadway play? But the issue is even deeper, which is that Rousseau thinks language itself has degenerated. For Rousseau, classical languages were more ambiguous but more artistic. Modern languages, by trying to be rational, have lost their persuasive force. This is definitely true. When I read classical Chinese, I have no idea what they're saying. I mean, partially because I'm not really great at classical Chinese, but the language itself is highly ambiguous. But it has rhythm to it. It has meter. It has a power, a persuasive power beyond its semantic content that modern Chinese and the rationality of that language, same thing with modern English, modern French, modern German, just does not have. So that's how deeply this problem runs. That through reason, even our language has degenerated. Okay. But there are ways, even in modernity, to make political life more theatrical, or to put it in the reverse, to make theater more participatory. Rousseau, for example, advises Poland to create a system of never-ending competition, where its citizens compete over doing virtuous actions for the community. And what you win, again, is not private money, it's public honor and eventually public office. So by injecting art into life this way, art ceases to be deceptive, it ceases to be two-faced and hypocritical, because essence becomes appearance. Okay, there's no art and life. There's no, you watch Avatar and you drive home in your Hummer. Art becomes life itself. So that's art, and it has a foundational role to play in the good state. Philosophy also has a foundational role to play, and it's also about giving philosophy more power and prestige, but in a very different way from art. Rousseau suggests that rulers give the best philosophers a path to advise the political elite and to win status, wealth, recognition through that path. I quote to you Rousseau. "The prince of eloquence, Cicero, was consul of Rome, and the greatest perhaps of philosophers, Bacon, chancellor of England. If the one had held only a chair in some university, and the other obtained only a modest pension from an academy, can it be believed, I say, that their work would not have reflected their status?" That's the quote on prestige. Here's the quote on wealth. "The rich and the learned serve only to corrupt each other mutually. If the rich were more learned or the learned richer, the latter would not be such cowardly flatterers, and the former would like base flattery less, and they would all be better off. That is what can be seen from the small number of those who have the good fortune to be learned and rich at the same time." The insight here is that intellectuals are a class, just like the capitalists are a class, just like the workers are a class, who are trying to expand their self-interest and satisfy their pride. If you just leave them out in the open, they're either going to flatter to the rich, get patronage, or they're going to want to attack your society for notoriety. So what you have to do as the ruler is to align the incentives of the intellectual class so that they can satisfy both their desires for wealth and recognition by serving rather than attacking your polis. What you definitely don't want to do is how we treat our intellectual class today. They're overworked, underpaid, where the supply of humanities scholars far outpaces the demand, where they have to publish or perish, where there's a cultural incentive to attack America. Intellectuals already want to attack your society, and you're just pouring fuel on the fire. Now, Rousseau, to be clear here, doesn't think all intellectuals need this. He himself said that his intellectual production came from alienation from power. But again, you need to view the entire group as a class. In the same way that you bribe your capitalist class by lowering the taxes, you can't forget to bribe your intellectual class. So that's what you don't want to do. And as a positive example of successfully combining worldly power with intellect, Rousseau gives an example of ancient China, specifically the Chinese imperial exams. Now, the Chinese imperial exams were one of the greatest meritocratic institutions in the pre-modern world, where every few years there will be an empire-wide exam that's available to all the male citizenry, commoner or noble. You're tested on the great books, you're tested on policy, you're tested on calligraphy sometimes, And doing well on those tests directly placed you into the bureaucracy, sometimes right at the top. So just to give you guys an idea of how important these exams were, my family on my mother's side was one of the great houses in the empire, and it was able to sustain itself for 600 years by mostly just producing scholars. That's how important these exams were. Okay, so think Game of Thrones, but for taking the SAT. The path is you master the great books, you do well in the imperial exams, and you advise the emperor. Okay, so far so good. That sounds great, right? Exactly what Rousseau is suggesting. But Rousseau brings up the Chinese imperial exams not as a positive example, but as a negative example of why China eventually fell to the Mongols. And I think I can tease out what we're missing with an anecdote. So my mother, whom this scholarly line runs through, always told me ever since I was a kid, 书中自有颜如玉，书中自有黄金屋. In books, you can find faces of jade. In books, you can find houses of gold. Did you get that? Let me Americanize it so you guys understand. Books, make bank, get laid. Now you know why I read so much. Of course, that was a vestige of imperial sentiment, right? But that was not an exaggeration. In fact, it was an understatement, because doing well in the imperial exam got you a lot more than just women and gold. And herein lies the issue. The imperial exams have pushed the desire for enlightenment onto the Chinese people. After a millennia, it has pushed the desire for enlightenment on everyone because it was open for everyone. And that popular enlightenment led to all the issues, including military weakness and eventually defeat by the Mongols. The issue with the imperial exams is that they were too meritocratic. And here's where his suggestions between art and philosophy radically diverge in the good state. Art is to envelop the political world, but philosophy is to be restrained to the elite of the elite. Philosophy is to be practiced esoterically with the top philosophers advising the top political ruling elite in private. Okay, here's the obvious question. How are we going to get the top philosophers if you don't have a public education system of philosophy, or you don't have a public system of competition like the imperial exams? Rousseau's answer is that this lack of teachers is not going to hurt the development of our few wise men, which again are the only people we want to be doing science and philosophy in the first place. In fact, not only do these people not need the guidance of teachers, having teachers would limit them. In summary then, philosophy as well as art both have roles to play in the good state. Philosophy is to be drastically limited from where it is now, and art is to be drastically expanded. But both are done in such a way that the interests of the intellectuals are much better aligned with the interests of the community. So that concludes my reconstruction of Rousseau's solution to the problem of enlightenment and part 2 of this lecture. But lest this lecture itself be a case of the type of useless navel-gazing that Rousseau criticizes, we must ask our last question. What does the first discourse, this book right here, have to teach us in the 21st century? Before I can give my answer, I think we must substantively revise one of Rousseau's critical arguments, that science was useless. Science clearly is no longer useless through technology. So let's re-examine Rousseau's rhetorical question. Answer me then, illustrious philosophers, you to whom we owe it to know in what ratios bodies attract one another in a vacuum, which curves have conjugate points, which have inflection points, and which cusps. How man sees everything in God, how there is correspondence without communication between soul and body. What stars may be inhabited, what insects reproduce in an uncommon way. If you had never taught us any of those things, would we have been any the less numerous for it, any the less well-governed, the less formidable, the less flourishing, or the more perverse? At least to the question of numerous and formidable, we can confidently answer to Rousseau, yes, we would be without science. Studying how insects mate resulted in pheromone-based pest control, much healthier than the chemical one. Studying the communication between soul and body, neuroscience, is literally making the paralyzed walk and the blind see. It's literally, for New Testament, miraculous. Boolean algebra, that seemed like useless math puzzles for decades, became the backbone of computing. Rousseau was not wrong in his time, but since his time, technology has joined power and intellect to the hip. What the Chinese imperial exams did socially, the more you study, the higher social position you'll be given. Technology does naturally. The more you study, the better you can manipulate the natural world. Take warfare as an example. Rousseau's argument is that on net, enlightened societies will lose to unenlightened societies because science saps your will, right, destroys your social bonds, reduces your force. The time you spent studying useless insects is time you aren't spending drilling or making weapons. But today, the way you make better weapons is study useless things in science. So even if science still saps your will, it now drastically increases your force. And I think warfare is shifting from the logic of will to the logic of force. It's no longer about, can we hold Thermopylae with 300 Spartans? It's more about who has the better killer drone. And I think already World War II, with significant loss, of course, could be read as a race between Oppenheimer and Heisenberg about who could get the bomb first. And the world would look very different if the answer was Heisenberg, right? In that case, you'd gladly trade millions, if not tens of millions of soldiers for an elite group of scientists. And I don't think that type of trade would have ever been considered before the advent of technology. So now, let me be clear here. Will can still triumph over force. I think the Taliban defeat of the US-backed Afghans is a great reminder of that. Furthermore, force always mattered a great deal in historical conflict. Rousseau himself says, no matter how virtuous the American natives were, they just couldn't overcome the technological advantage of the European conquerors. But what's different now, I think, is that the acceleration of technology, and more importantly, the recognition of the acceleration of technology. How do we get a good military today? We make sure top minds are studying STEM. And that's, I don't think, the first thing that came to anyone's mind in pre-modern times. Here's another hint, I think, that the times are changing. Rousseau's argument is that in antiquity, Enlightenment passes from the conquered to the conqueror. Why? Because Enlightenment makes you weak, makes you lose, you get conquered by someone who's not enlightened. So the example here is the Chinese to the Mongols, the Greeks to the Romans to the Gauls. In the past 300 years, Enlightenment has been passed in the direction from conqueror to conquered, basically Europe to everyone else. And that tells you something about how the relationship between enlightenment and worldly power has changed. This change, this joining of the hip of worldly power and intellect exists, I think, not only on the military side, but also on the economic and cultural front. If you don't control the latest productive technologies, your citizens will be condemned to do the lowest value-adding task that no one else wants to do. If you don't control the latest media technologies, your country will be force-fed foreign faces, foreign values, foreign stories. The combination of intellect and worldly power through technology means that Rousseau's strategy of conservation, okay, let's try to push science back as much as we can, and let's try to stem its excesses, is no longer, I think, a viable solution. No state today, I think, in their right minds, can afford to neglect science and technology. I think even standing still, much less pushing back, is no longer viable. Here, I think, lies philosophy's role in such a world, which is to guide the development of technology by making clear what the choices are. So I want to be clear here. It's not that philosophy will make technologists or people using technology more moral. Philosophy is not going to convince you to stop being thirsty, but philosophy can tell you which cup has water and which cup has gasoline. And I think philosophy is suited to do this because it has been asking useless questions about the fabric of reality for millennia. But as technology and science transform deeper and deeper layers of that very fabric, these questions are now critical. Is sentiment or is reason the foundation of morality? That's going to be an important question when we can bioengineer humans very soon. Do we care about the recognition from non-human sources? That's going to be an important question with the amount of AI companions, the first of which are already with us. Can deterministic agents be held morally responsible? That's going to be a key question for regulating self-driving cars. In a world where change can be arrested, I think philosophy should be in the role of conservation, preservation. But in our world, where we must surf this change, I think philosophy has a more public role to play, which is to outline to decision makers the consequences of their choices. Elucidation. What I hope to have elucidated for you guys in this lecture today is the consequence of pursuing science and art, not primarily on worldly power, but on the good life, on virtue. Because remember, to say that science is no longer useless, that it is now powerful, does not nullify the bulk of Rousseau's arguments, which are on how science threatens a good life, how it threatens virtue. I quote to you Rousseau, "I'm forever being told about power and greatness. I, for my part, was talking about morals and virtue." Therefore, Rousseau's critique of the 21st century, I think, would be even more forceful than his critique of the 18th. If Rousseau is right, that science brings moral corruption, that it degrades our virtues, then I think it's a terrible thing that science has now become powerful. Why? Because in Rousseau's time, when push comes to shove, the virtuous, non-enlightened state wins against the viceful, enlightened state. At least we have the solace of knowing that Sparta is eventually going to triumph over Athens. At least the wise statesman could choose the side of both virtue and power, however difficult, by rejecting science. But today, the statesman, if Rousseau is right, is faced with two equally untenable choices. You cultivate science, you grow your power, but you destroy your virtue. Or you reject science, you protect your virtue, or you get conquered by the corrupt. The most terrifying possibility, I think, that Rousseau's line of critique raises is that our societies have not been designed for the flourishing of man, but the acceleration of science. Contrarianism destroys the social fabric, but it's important for an innovation culture. Diversity in thought undermines our shared beliefs, but greatly accelerates scientific progress. Immigration harms community feeling, but is what you need to attract the best engineering talent of the world. A rational society turns us into elementary particles, but is the most compatible with the scientific worldview. The terrifying Rousseauian thought is this: what if our values didn't win because they were good, but because they were powerful, because they allowed us to build better technologies? Let me ask the question this way: why did Asia adopt Western values in the 20th century? Why did China send her best and brightest in the early 20th century to study in Europe? Why did the Meiji Emperor adopt Western institutions? Was it because they read Kant? Was it because they suddenly realized these self-evident rights under their noses, hidden for millennia? It was because the Qing Empire had its ass handed to it on the battlefield. It was because the Japanese were awestruck by Commodore Perry's warships. Asian rulers realized that to import modern technologies meant that you had to import modern morals. The morals were imported then, not because they made the citizens more virtuous, but because it made the state more powerful. We send our kids today to study the arts and sciences, not to make them better people, but so that they can also find faces of jade and houses of gold. The terrifying possibility that Rousseau raises is that the exact values needed for the progress of science are precisely the ones detrimental to the good life. Science is not in the service of man, but man in the service of science. So as we extend our dominion across the natural world through the advances of technology, the first discourse is only becoming more and not less relevant. And the question it has for the 21st century is this: for what shall science profit man, even if he shall gain the whole world, but lose his own soul? Thank you. Thanks for watching my lecture. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then go join my email list at greatbooks.io. You'll not only get lectures and interviews, but also transcripts, book summaries, and essays, all to help you explore the key ideas from the most important books in history. Now, one thing you might be wondering after this lecture is, if reason is not the foundation of the good state for Rousseau, what is? His answer is going to be heroes, or more specifically, the imitation of heroes. Heroes for Rousseau aren't just ornamentation. Okay? They're not just a nice to have, a cherry on top. They are core, they're foundational to a good community. Now, we live in a very weird age, where superheroes have never been more popular in movies, but real heroes have never been more absent in society. So if you want to learn about why society needs heroes and why we can no longer produce them, then go check out my interview with Professor Christopher Kelly. You can find links to everything we discussed today, including transcripts and my book notes, in the description, as well as on my website, greatbooks.io. Thank you so much.